Hello everyone! For every single generation of competitive Pokemon, both singles and doubles, the species clause has been a firm and relatively unquestioned rule. The idea is simple. You can't use more than one Pokemon of the same species on your team. You can't use two Gholdengo or two Kingambits. You can, however, use a Chansey and a Blissey on the same team. What is considered the same species depends on the Pokedex number. This clause generally faces very little opposition. The only controversial aspect of the species clause is that you also can't use different forms on the same team, so you can't run Rotom Heat and Rotom Wash together. You can't use two different Silvally types on the same team, and most controversial of all, you can't use regional forms together either. So Galar Slowking and Kanto Slowking can't be on the same team, despite having different types and move pools. They have a lot of unique qualities, but regional forms have the same Pokedex number. Other than the rare pushback about regional forms, though, I've never seen anyone speak out against the species clause. It encourages more creative team building by preventing you from using the same powerful Pokemon multiple times. It also takes pressure off team building, since you don't have to worry about facing multiple copies of a threat. One Dragonite is hard enough to deal with, imagine if you had to face 3 of them. These arguments seem solid, but are they really? Isn't it also creative team building to find ways to make 2 of the same Pokemon work well without the team becoming too weak to certain threats? And although it definitely would be rough to deal with the same major threat to your team multiple times in one battle, how often would this realistically happen? In fact, if the species clause was abolished, would it even be a good idea to use multiple of the same Pokemon on the same team? These are the questions I seek to answer in this video. I'll be discussing the species clause, going over what I think would happen if it was removed, and finally, if I think it would be a good idea to get rid of it or not. I'll be analyzing through the lens of the main format for competitive singles, Scarlet and Violet Overused, but I'll refer to other formats and generations as well for the sake of gathering evidence. Let's get right into it. So, what if all of a sudden there was no species clause in Overused? Well, right off the bat, new toy syndrome would settle in. Almost every team would be doubling up or more on some Pokemon, and it would probably be a lot of top tiers. You'd be facing teams with 6 Iron Valiant, 6 Zamazenta, 6 Gholdengo, that kind of thing. There would also be less extreme cases, people only running 2 Gholdengo or 2 Great Tusk. Definitely multiple forms of Ogerpon would be out there together. And then there would also just be some people overjoyed that they can finally run Galar Weezing and Kanto Weezing together. And these teams would be pretty bad for the most part. I can quite confidently say that the top of the ladder would be people using teams with 6 different Pokemon, while those messing around with doubling up or more would probably be losing a lot of elo. New toys are shiny and fun, but the people that perform best in these transitioning metagames are those that stick to the old, reliable strategies and implement some minor adjustments to counter whatever new toy has been added. Eventually, the teams of 6 Iron Valiant and all the other nonsense would calm down and really only be seen in low ladder. But as the dust settles, would running multiple of any Pokemon prove to be an effective strategy? Well, it's definitely possible. Let me explain how. In Pokemon, there's a concept I call offensive overlap. Basically, it means you have 2 or more offensive Pokemon that are countered by similar defensive Pokemon. So, for example, take Dragonite and Ceruledge. Dragonite is a Dragon Dance sweeper and Ceruledge is a Swords Dance sweeper, and they struggle with some of the same things. Dondozo, for example, is an answer to both. You might think that this means running Ceruledge and Dragonite together is a bad idea, since if you encounter a single Dondozo, that one Pokemon shuts down 2 of yours. But if you have the right set, offensive overlap can be used to your advantage. Suppose your Dragonite is a loaded dice set, Terra Fire with Dragon Dance, Fire Punch, Scale Shot, and Encore. This can do a lot of damage to Dondozo switching in by using Scale Shot, and you can lock Dondozo into Curse or Rest if it attempts to do anything other than attack. You can weaken Dondozo so much that even if Dragonite doesn't end up killing it, Dondozo will die later to a Ceruledge Poltergeist or even close combat if it's weak enough. Dragonite can essentially pave the way for Ceruledge to sweep, using this concept of offensive overlap. The problem with this is, although these 2 Pokemon may share some counters, they certainly don't share them all. Your opponent's answer to Dragonite may be a Pecharunt, aiming to poison you with Malignant Chain, and they may count on Landorus to deal with Ceruledge, something that will definitely not be switched into Dragonite for fear of Ice Spinner. So in this case, the offensive overlap would fail. For this strategy of weakening shared counters to be as effective as possible, you really want the 2 or more Pokemon involved to share as many of the same counters as possible. Garchomp and Dragonite would be a more effective example of offensive overlap than Ceruledge and Dragonite, but even this will fail sometimes. Maybe your opponent has Zamazenta for Garchomp and a Tickle Alomomola to PP stall Dragonite's Dragon Dances. You can probably see where this is going. The most effective way to have the most potent offensive overlap possible is to use multiple copies of the same Pokemon. One Iron Valiant and another Iron Valiant share the exact same counters, at least according to your opponent, who doesn't know your sets. But you can design the sets so your duplicate Pokemon can wear counters down for one another and allow the other to sweep. This is what I personally think is the biggest risk if the species clause was terminated. Would the right sets on pairs of Iron Valiant, Gholdengo, Dragonite, or Zamazenta overwhelm the defenses of otherwise well-built teams? It's hard to theorize about. I did build some teams that doubled up on major OU threats for the background footage you're watching, but this is a small sample size and it was difficult to effectively test these teams since they obviously aren't legal on the ladder. To get a better idea of how this would really impact the metagame, I wanted to look at a format where there is no species clause. There aren't many such formats, and many of them are pretty wacky, like a format where the only move you can use is Metronome. I'm sure there are plenty of other insane metagames where there's no species clause, but these aren't helpful to look at. We want to look at a metagame that would give us an idea of what eliminating the species clause would do to a major tier like OverUsed. The most grounded format without the species clause that also has enough players to have a real metagame is Anything Goes. This is a format where you can use absolutely anything you want as long as it's possible in-game without hacking. Nothing is banned. You can use evasion moves, baton pass, and most importantly for our purposes, you can use as many of any Pokemon as you want, thus explaining the several Deoxys attack you see in the background footage. So, to answer some of the questions we have about the species clause, it's helpful to look and see how the lack of the species clause is abused in this tier. Are people commonly using multiple of the same Pokemon? Well, the answer is yes, but basically only Arceus. Arceus is a bit of a special case. It has base 120 in every stat, so it can run either physical or special sets. Its type also depends on the plate it's holding, so Arceus can be any type other than Stellar. Its special 100 base power signature move, Judgment, also changes type to match the plate, and on top of all that, Arceus has one of the most expansive move pools in all of Pokemon. So basically, on the same team, two Arceus can do completely different things. You can have a water-type Arceus acting as a defensive wall, and a normal-type Arceus acting as a Swords Dance Extreme Speed Sweeper on the same team, and they have almost nothing in common other than name and stats. There is no similar Pokemon in OverUsed. We don't have any Pokemon that has so many diverse forms that a similar effect could occur. Lower tiers may experience something like this Arceus effect with Silvally sets or potentially Rotom, but nothing to the level we see with Arceus in Anything Goes. Other than Arceus, doubling up or more on a Pokemon in Anything Goes is very rare, and many of these instances aren't indicators of potential problems in OverUsed. Multiple Ho-Oh and Yveltal have been seen on defensive teams, but there is no Pokemon so defensively dominant in OverUsed that several would be run, other than maybe in rare cases Dondozo or Gliscor. Multiple Smeargle is sometimes seen on Baton Pass teams, but this is much more of a Moody and Baton Pass issue than a Species Clause issue. Anything Goes Trick Room teams occasionally run multiple Hatterene, but their purpose is really just to keep hazards off the field, set Trick Room, and die. The big question is, do we see the offensive overlap we're really concerned about? Do we see multiple copies of offensive Pokemon effectively being used to break down defensive cores? The answer is yes, but as I said, it's quite rare. In past generations, some Psy-Spam teams would use multiple Deoxys attack with Tapu Lele, but Miraidon's electric terrain setting really put an end to such strategies in Generation 9. When this strategy was viable though, multiple Deoxys attack could overwhelm Dark and Steel types, leaving them free to terrorize the rest of the team with boosted psychic attacks and an immunity to priority. Multiple Geomancy Xerneas have also been seen in the past, similarly using this principle of offensive overlap. Multiple Zacian Crown have been seen, multiple Swords Dance Extreme Speed Normal Arceus has been used as well. In Generation 9 Anything Goes, Koraidon and Miraidon are the main Pokemon that are repeated on the same team, once again using this offensive overlap principle. The first Miraidon may die chipping down the Ting Lu, the second one finishes it off. That's the basic idea with all of these cores. But, as I'll repeat again, these teams are rare. It may seem like multiple Miraidon would be absolutely broken, but these teams aren't dominating tournaments or having massive success on the ladder. What we can learn from looking at Anything Goes is that team diversity is a strength. Every different Pokemon you have is another Pokemon that could be great against your opponent's team. It also gives your team a more diverse and effective defensive core. And although offensive overlap can destroy your opponent's defensive cores, if your opponent does a good job of preserving the defensive Pokemon you're particularly targeting, or if their team happens to be very solid against the Pokemon you brought more than one of, you're in serious trouble. So as terrifying as it seems to have 3 or 4 Miraidon, it just doesn't end up working nearly as well as you might think. It stacks those defensive weaknesses onto your team and isn't even guaranteed to be effective at breaking. Now let's take this knowledge and apply it to Overused. As I said, we have nothing like Arceus. Probably the closest thing is Ogerpon, and given how much the Ogerpon forms like using Terra, they probably wouldn't enjoy being paired together too much anyway. I expect that if the species clause was eliminated after the initial period of hype, we'd see far fewer repeated Pokemon in OU than Anything Goes, even if we exclude Arceus. Other than Arceus, the main 2 Pokemon that are repeated are Koraidon and Miraidon, which are both at around 50% usage in high ladder. We don't have anything this powerful or dominant in Overused. If a Pokemon gets to that point, it gets banned. I would say there is nothing so good in Overused that it would be commonly advantageous to run multiple. Now, sure, people would still do it. You'd see multiple Iron Valiant teams. You'd see teams with Assault Vest Alomomola and Physically Defensive Alomomola. You'd see Sun teams with a couple of Walking Wakes. But I don't think these teams would be good. These teams I built for background footage, despite me only showing the replays where the double up strategy worked, I lost a ton of games getting these replays. In a lot of the games, the core didn't work nearly as well as I'd hoped. My 2 Iron Valiant would get hard-walled by a specially defensive Heatran, or my 2 Zamazenta would end up doing nothing into a team with something like Toxapex. I was underwhelmed by stacking the same Pokemon, and I expect other builders would have a similar experience. I think running several of the same Pokemon would quickly die off as a trend. There would be a few rare cases of good teams using multiple of the same Pokemon, I'm sure. Maybe a double Hatterene Trick Room, a double Dondozo Stall, maybe even a double Iron Valiant Hyper Offense, but I highly doubt it would be common. By now, you have a good idea of what I think the metagame would look like if the species clause was abolished. Probably it would look much like it does today. So now for the final question. Do I think we should do away with the species clause? Well, on one hand, it would allow for more in the team builder. It would undoubtedly be a loss for tier diversity on a species basis, but it would enable new strategies. And, as I said, I don't think these teams with multiple of the same Pokemon would actually be very good. The fear of running into Zamazenta teams, for example, where one Zamazenta is Life Orb with Terra Dark Crunch to destroy your Pecharunt and Heavy Slam to kill your Clefable, all while an Iron Defense Zamazenta sits in the back. I don't think these teams would actually be common, effective, or really good at all. And you might think that stacking multiple copies of major sweepers like Dragonite, Raging Bolt, or Ceruledge sounds insane, but you have to realize that only one of them can Terra. This really limits the effectiveness of a lot of theoretically broken combos. I'm quite confident that most of these teams would just be bad. Here's the problem though. Being bad doesn't stop people from using it. It's kind of like Hypnosis back when that was legal. A move that does absolutely nothing 40% of the time and results in a second turn wake up 20% of the time isn't that good on a lot of Pokemon. But people were spamming it anyway, and it was super annoying. Similarly, a team with 3 Dragonites probably isn't good and it wouldn't be effective, but you'd sometimes run into it, and if you have a bad matchup, you're going to get steamrolled. This is the main reason I'd ultimately have to say I'd rather the species clause stay in place. I don't think it would change the tier much, and some of the little changes would be positive. Your friend that loves Rotom could run Rotom Wash and Rotom Heat together, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that. But some of the double or triple Iron Valiant teams, or double Zamazenta teams, would just be dumb matchup fishes that win or lose based on how solid your team is against one specific Pokemon. I don't think this is a healthy burden to have in the team builder. It's also a shame that the removal of the species clause would really only help top tiers that are already amazing. We're not going to see people running 2 Mamoswine or 2 Fezandipity or other niche Pokemon, at least not in high level play. In Anything Goes, the most commonly repeated Pokemon are the absolute top tiers, and we can safely assume it would be the same in Overused. It's probably going to be Iron Valiant and Zamazenta for the most part. Definitely not Pokemon that need the spotlight anymore. So I'd say it's in everyone's best interest to keep the species clause intact. Removing it would be nice for some small things, but ultimately create more problems than the small benefits would be worth. But let me know what you think. Do you want the species clause to be eliminated? And if it was eliminated, what strategies would you want to try? Also, let me know if you think there's anything I left out. Are there any major pros or cons to the species clause that you think I should have mentioned? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.